With today's speaker, I'd like to remind you that the Institute on World Affairs is an activity open to the entire ISU community. If you're here, you're part of that community, and we'd welcome your participation. We'll begin meeting Monday after next at 4 o'clock in the Pine Room. We'll talk over this week for a few minutes, and then we'll start arguing about what we'll choose for next year. We try to choose the most important topic in the world, and then we go out looking for the most important people we can, the most interesting, the most knowledgeable, those that can tell us the most to understand that topic better. And if you're at all interested, or there's someone somewhere in the world you'd like to have come here and have this university here, come get involved in the Institute, take part in the discussion, and you can play a part in the way this works out next year. So please think about that.
Welcome to this noon's lecture. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to bring to your attention that tonight Jane Cortez is going to be giving a lecture in the Sunroom on economy, ecology, and poetry. And then tomorrow at noon here in the Pioneer Room, we have a Pamela Spar speaking on engendering change, women in the New World Order. Today's speaker, Mitsuyo Goto, served in executive positions in Europe and Japan with the Nissan Motor Company before forming his own international consulting firm for the auto industry. While with Nissan, he was in charge of the international affairs, and he also worked in Europe when Nissan opened its early plants in the UK. He's a graduate of Wabash College in Indiana, and he did his graduate work at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He was managing director for the Japan Center for International Exchange and is author of Speaking Out for Japan, My Discipline in Internationalism. He's on the board of advisors for the Belgian Business School, a member of the Council of London's Policy Study Institute, and a recipient of the Benjamin Rush Award for Humanistic Values in Corporate Life. I introduce Mitsuyo Goto on U.S.-Japanese relations. Are we on a collision course?
Thank you, Jeff, for a generous introduction. My last name, Goto, is spelled G-O-T-O. And when I went to Wabash College years and years ago, some of my classmates would call me Goat, or Hi Goat, or even call me Hi Billy Goat. So around 1974, in the wake of first energy crisis, Japanese cars started selling like hotcakes in America and touched off a small car war, the term that the Japanese mass media coined. And I thought my nickname should be Scape, as in scapegoat. So if you like to call me Scape, I'd be very happy. In fact, my nickname was written up on the front page of Wall Street Journal in February 1975. So I'm very pleased to be on the campus of Iowa State University today and feel honored to be invited by the Institute on World Affairs to speak to you today, especially the day after the important presidential election. I don't know why you chose this particular date for me to speak, but I'm delighted, feel honored to be here today. I see sometimes there are two kinds of dreams that I see, and not that I see dreams that often. One dream that I sometimes see is myself walking up to a podium like this, facing an American audience such as yours, unable to utter a single word of English. You see, I did not speak a word of English until I was about 17 or 18. So sometimes I see this kind of dream and wake up and having really cold feet. The other, then I'm also reminded of a young Japanese boy, someone like me who came to this country to study. His English was so poor that whenever he wanted to say something, he had to look up words in his pocket Japanese English dictionary. One day he was invited to a party where he was introduced a pretty American girl. So he quickly looked up his dictionary and said, "You have a beautiful hide, H-I-D-E." You see, in Japanese, there are one or possibly two words which would describe outer coverings of anything, but in English you say, strange enough, human beings and pigs have skin, and horses and cows have hide on them, tree has a bark, orange has a rind, banana has a peel, and peas have pods on them. and of course, I've known that there are some nuts in this country which have nut shells on them, but skin on them also. But his friend immediately noticed, the American friend said to him, no, young man, you should have used the word skin in a case like that. Complexion would be too much for him. So following Sunday, he goes to the local church where the congregation was singing the hymn, hide me, O my Savior. So he started singing, scheme me, O my Savior. Actually, the other kind of dream that I sometimes see is the sky filled with Boeing B-29 bombers that used to come drop bombs over us in the last years of the war. And I was then attending a boarding school on the outskirts of Tokyo, but in the last year of the war, all of us students who mobilized for war effort, we had to work in the nearby Nakajima aircraft engine factory, operating lathes and things like that. and that became the first target of the B-29 bombers based in Marianas in November 1944. And the first wave of B-29s came in high altitude. And since from my childhood I was always interested in airplanes and cars, I disregarded the order to stay in the air raid shelter and watch these B-29s come on high altitude in broad daylight, and their bomb base open and bombs coming down. And fortunately, the plant went up in smoke, but nobody was injured. And I remember seeing Japanese anti-aircraft guns being shot, but the B-29s came in such high altitude that the guns could not get to them. But I do remember seeing a Japanese fighter plane, kamikaze style, crash into one of the B-29s, and both planes coming down. This was the first time we Japanese got to see what the B-29 looked like, because there had been no published picture of the aircraft in the newspaper or magazines. And I was really fascinated with these long-range bombers. Now, after the Nakajima aircraft plant went up in smoke, I then returned to my hometown, which is Nagoya, a big industrial city between Tokyo and Osaka, or for that matter, between Kyoto and Tokyo. And my father said to me that perhaps B-29s will start coming to Nagoya also, because Nagoya was the home of Mitsubishi aircraft, which used to produce famous Zero fighters. And sure enough, in March of 1945, B-29 started coming, dropping bombs over us. But sometimes they would come nighttime. And if you hear the engine, each plane having 4 engines, and there are normally about 300 to 500 B-29s in the air. The engine noise alone had devastating psychological effect on us down below. And then we would cringe in the air raid shelter, and we soon hear bombs exploding nearby. And then on May 17, 1945, 3 months before war came to an end, my parental home, which was a big Japanese-style home in Nagoya, went up in smoke after 513 B-29s in a particular raid dropped incendiary bombs in Nagoya. And I remember standing on the smoldering ruins of my parental home, saying to myself, my God, what have we done? And it made me wonder why the Japanese army generals, Tojo was the prime minister, army general, who attacked Pearl Harbor in the first place, and wondered why Japan ever declared war against the United States. I was really mad at the Japanese army generals who started this last war, and also wondered if they had maintained a good dialogue with President of the United States, Secretary of State, perhaps war could have been avoided. Or if they had much better understanding of the great expanse of America, especially the Midwestern part of the United States, and your industrial capability, I think war could not have happened. And so when the war came to an end, and then after I graduated from this boarding school, senior high school, I decided that I would not want to go on to college in Japan, but rather I would grab first opportunity offered to me to come to the United States to continue my studies. But I said to myself, first, you have to study the language. So during the day, I worked on my father's farm just outside of Nagoya. And my father, being absentee landlord, land would have been taken away by tenants if I did not work on my father's farm under MacArthur's new agricultural policy. And so during the day, I worked on my father's farm. By night, I would listen to the Armed Forces radio. Japan was still under the Allied occupation, and listen to especially newscasts. And then, imitating the radio announcer, who was normally a GI, I would read aloud the only English language newspaper published then, the Japan Times, trying to memorize phrases, words, and sentences. And when I became reasonably proficient in the language in about a year and a half, I then decided to go work for the local U.S. military government in Nagoya, where a lot of my American friends would write to their own colleges and universities and to see if they had scholarship available for me, but in vain. I was also working with a young American in mid-30s, a civilian employee from Ladoga, Indiana, a tiny town of 500 people. Even people in Indiana don't know where Ladoga is. But anyway, one day this fellow became seriously ill. He had bulbar-type polio that affected his neck. He had a hard time breathing, and he was flown to U.S. military hospital in Osaka and remained in an oxygen tent for 10 days, but died there 10 days later. It just so happened that a few days he was stricken, I had taken his picture in the office. And when I wrote a letter of condolence to his mother back home in Indiana, I thought she would like to have his picture, so I enclosed it. And toward the end of my letter, I said, someday I would very much like to come to your country to continue my education. And she evidently had heard about me from her son. And she was good enough to drive to Crawfordsville, Indiana, which is about 14 miles from Ladoga. And she talked to the admissions director at Wabash College. And eventually, Wabash College gave me a scholarship. So only because her son did not make it back to Indiana, I was able to come. And I had 4 years of wonderful education. in the heart of the Midwest. So I became a kind of a Japanese Hoosier, and and then I also received a fellowship to do graduate work at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. So I've had, education-wise, best of both worlds, and I'll be forever grateful to my American friends who made it possible for me to come to the United States in the first place. Now today I'm supposed to be talking about U.S.-Japan relations, whether we are on a collision course. My thoughts always go back to January of this year when President George Bush evidently was persuaded by then Commerce Secretary Bob Mosbacher to bring 21 U.S. business leaders in the auto sector. And I personally have had very good relations with chairman of the big threes of Detroit, Lee Iacocca. He also had done graduate work in engineering at Princeton, and I got to know him very well. He was president of Ford Motor Company. And then Red Pauling, chairman of Ford, and Bob Stemple. Of course, he had to step down just a few days ago, but actually, one of the Japanese automakers said at the time that when there are so many of us, we cannot possibly have meaningful discussion, you know. And in fact, in advance of their visit, both American and Japanese government negotiators negotiated a sort of a auto parts purchase plans. And I think on a voluntary basis, Japanese automakers now made commitments to buy as much as $19 billion worth of auto parts from U.S. suppliers by 1994. But already there had been so much goodwill on the part of Japanese automakers, also on the part of our government, to want to buy more from the United States. And actually, since becoming independent international consultant, I've been retained by chairman of the Timken Company, which is the biggest bearings manufacturer in the United States, and also by chairman of Arvind Industries in Columbus, Indiana, which is the U.S. biggest auto exhaust system manufacturer, along with shock absorbers. And their chairman also asked to come to Japan with the president, but turned the president down in saying they do not want to be politicized. I'm also reminded of as a result, the auto issue was really highlighted, because of President Bush's visit to Japan. I'm reminded of the story of a Chrysler dealer somewhere, small town, USA, and the story that Lester Schroe, who is dean of the Sloan School of Management at MIT, personally told me. Now, this was a Chrysler dealer in the days when Chrysler Corporation was having grave financial difficulties, and the dealer found it very difficult to move Chrysler cars from his showroom floor, and he became more and more depressed. So he took to alcohol, and eventually his wife and children left him. One evening he was nursing a bottle with his shaky hands, and suddenly out came smoke, and with it a genie. Now Jenny said to him, "Thank you for having gotten me out of this bottle. In gratitude, I'd like to grant your last wish." So the Chrysler dealer says, get me an import dealership. When the smoke cleared and the genie disappeared, the Chrysler dealer found himself in the middle of Tokyo selling Chrysler cars. Actually, the Wall Street Journal had an editorial in January that said Japan should have kept Lee Iacocca in Japan so that he would be directing sales of Chrysler cars in Japan. Actually, I felt this would be a golden opportunity for Prime Minister Miyazawa, first Japanese Prime Minister who is very international minded and also who is able to speak English fluently. I thought maybe by getting together with the President of the United States, they can discuss broader issues, global issues, where Japan and the United States could possibly collaborate. But instead, if you recall, at the dinner hosted by our Prime Minister, President Bush threw up, and that was very unfortunate. He was probably very tired after a grueling trip to Australia and other parts of Asia. And so they did not get to discuss more important issues of the day. Maybe this being the day after the presidential election, I should be talking about Texas businessman Ross Perot. But remember T. Boone Pickens, the famous Texas oil man, started coming to Japan like a couple of years ago, in saying that now that his company had 26% of the Japanese headlight manufacturer called Koito Manufacturing, that 3 of his men be placed on the Japanese company's board, and the Japanese company also increased dividend payouts. And he kept coming back to Japan. But over the years, I got to meet him and see him, and I began to like this man. He one day gave me his autobiography and autograph. And in reading his autobiography, I admired the way he managed his own company, how he treated everyone in his company. Just like the Japanese company. There's no distinction between blue collar and white collar, etc. But he also told me a story of 2 American women walking down one of the fashionable streets downtown Houston one day when they heard found a frog in the gutter. The frog started talking to them and saying that I used to be an oil man, but the spell was cast, I became a frog. Now, if one of you were to pick me up and kiss me, I'll be able to turn back into an oil man. So one of the women picked him up, and instead of kissing him, she put him in her purse. And they continued down the street. After a while, this other woman got concerned and said to the other, "Why didn't you kiss him?" And the other woman said, "Nowadays, a talking frog is worth more than an oil man." But as you know, he was not successful in taking over a Japanese company, and he often appeared before congressional committees saying that the Japanese companies are not open to foreign investors, etc. Also, beginning January of 1990, Japanese government and the U.S. Negotiators began a series of negotiations that were called SII, which means Structural Impediment Initiative. Almost sounds like a Star Wars initiative or something. And U.S. side came up with as many as 75 different demands, ranging from Japan start buying American rice. Japan opened up its market to big toy stores such as I can never pronounce that word. Toys R Us. That's a jawbreaker. And down to we Japanese stop being workaholics and take more paid holidays, and also knowing that we have penchant for personal savings. On the average, we save 15 to 16% of our annual income into put that into a personal savings account, as against your 5 to 6%. So American trade negotiators who come to Japan say to us, you become spendthrift and buy more from America, etc. So I was beginning to feel that now, wait a minute, you are getting into our domestic, meddling in our domestic affairs. But even the poll conducted by a Japanese newspaper I believe in April of 1990, some 40% of Japanese poll felt that some of the U.S. demands are justifiable. 60% of Japanese poll also felt that Japan ought to start buying American rice bit by bit. Because food stuff in Japan tends to be very expensive compared to the food prices here in the United States. And then the Japanese side, not to be outdone, for the first time came up with a dozen demands to the United States. Of course, the Japanese negotiators would say that U.S. really ought to put its economic house in order by reducing huge federal budget deficit, reduce trade deficit with Japan, and you encourage your industries to become more productive, improve productivity and competitiveness, etc. Again, I'm reminded of the story of the admiral of the fleet, which was told by Marvin Runyon, whom Nissan moved away from Ford Motor Company to run Nissan's manufacturing operation in Tennessee. In fact, I was, while at Nissan Motor Company, I was in charge of U.S. investment project also. And this story of the Admiral fleet is one day an ensign on his flagship was watching the ship's radar screen, and he saw a small blip. So he shouted, "We are on a collision course. You change course." And the voice would come back and say, "You change course, and you change course," and they were getting nowhere. Finally, this ensign reports this back to the admiral. Now, admiral of the fleet now had a microphone in his hand. He said, "This is the admiral of the fleet. Whoever you are, change course." And the voice came back and saying, "God damn it, I'm the lighthouse. You change course." Well, I think U.S. negotiators know that we Japanese are very susceptible to external pressure. We would do something, we will always react to external pressure. And so they have always used kind of harsh tactics, harsh rhetoric to get us to do something. Actually, caving in, well, not exactly caving into pressure, but beginning about 5-6 years ago, I've been noticing proliferation of U.S. fast food chains in Japan. First was, of course, the McDonald's. hamburger joint. And then Colonel Sanders Fried Chicken came. And then Denny's came. Baskin Robbins ice cream joint came. Taco Bell and Pizza Hut. Everybody is now in Japan. And finally, 7-Eleven stores came in joint venture partnership with a Japanese retail chain called Ito Yokado. And there are now more than 4,000 outlets throughout Japan. And they are doing very good business. They have very good market research program. And the merchandise on their shelves changed so often to meet the demanding taste of Japanese. And actually, the parent company, Southland Corporation in Texas, began to have financial problems. And the Japanese side ended up going to the rescue of Southland Corporation. And the Japanese Ito Yokado now has, I believe, something like 60% equity in Southland Corporation. And I think this is a very good example of joint venture between American company and a Japanese company doing so well in Japan. Now, the Japanese populace is bombarded with what you Americans call junk food, but we don't call it that. Our youngsters really like your fast food restaurants. And it's very hard for me to keep my daughters from Baskin Robbins ice cream joints, for example. At any rate, we are beginning to see obese children because of changing food habits, and I'm afraid the rate of heart attack among older people is on the increase because we buy nowadays as much as 73% of your beef export. Can you imagine this? You know, sometimes Senator Max Baucus in Montana and other senators or congressmen would say to us, you must buy more American beef. And now we ended up buying as much as 73% of your beef export. I know United States, for example, restrict the import of inexpensive beef from Argentina or Australia. But we ended up buying so much American beef. We also buy nowadays something like 68% of your pork export, and much of which both beef and pork come from Iowa. In fact, between Iowa and Japan, Iowa has trade surplus with Japan. This morning I was just talking with Lieutenant Governor Joy Corning in Des Moines, and I got to see her in Tokyo in June of this year. She was just saying that, and that's really amazing. And we also buy 51% of U.S. citrus exports. So our warehouses are now bulging with grapefruits and oranges from the United States. And my family, for example, can enjoy grapefruit halves for breakfast every morning. Prices have come down, which is a very good thing. We also buy about 31% of your chicken export and about 25% of soybean export, corn export, feedstock export, and sorghum also, I think, and leaf tobacco. So we last year ended up buying as much as $8.1 billion worth of agricultural products from the United States. So we are United States' best agricultural customer. Now, Japanese industries also have been bending backwards, or Japanese government or government-owned universities also bending backwards to buy more and more from the United States. Some 7 years ago, the manufactured goods imported from the United States accounted for only 30% of imports from the United States. But last year, imports from the United States totaled like $53 billion, but 63% of which were in manufactured goods, such as satellite, space satellites, communications equipment, computers, $100 million worth of American movies, and American movies are very popular in Japan. And we are also buying, we like new Cadillac Seville, which is becoming very popular in Japan. Japanese youngsters like Ralph Lauren, outfits, and there are also Brooks Brothers stores in Japan now. And so it's not that we do not like to buy anything from America, as some of you are led to believe, but we really like things American still. And I hope more American companies would bend backwards to study the Japanese market and export their products to Japan. Actually, the Japanese today imports more on a per capita basis. Per capita dollar figure is something like $387 worth of U.S. products, versus on per capita basis, you Americans have been buying about $357 worth of Japanese goods. So that is where we now stand. Speaking of Iowa-Japan relations, in addition to your exports, Japanese companies have come to Iowa to invest. NSK, the Japanese bearings company, has a plant here. Bridgestone also invested here in Iowa. That's a tire company. And Ajinomoto, which is the company that makes seasoning called Accent, has a plant here in Iowa. Sumitomo Chemical also has come, and Honda parts distribution facility is here in Iowa. And Toyota Insurance Company of North America has just decided to locate its head office in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So more and more Japanese companies are also finding Iowa their American homes. In fact, when I was introduced, I used to be for a long time with Nissan Motor Company, which is a tiny, struggling Japanese automaker, and I was also spearheaded Nissan's drive to invest here in North America, and we began our feasibility studies as far back as 1974, and the final decision to invest in Smyrna, Tennessee, was made in time for the presidential election of 1980. It was a toss-up between Jimmy Carter's re-election or Ronald Reagan. And in the end, I was negotiating with governors of Tennessee and Georgia. Georgia governor was Democratic Governor George Busby. And I played them against each other to get a better deal. And finally, Nissan decided to go to Tennessee because Lamar Alexander, among other things, moved state legislature to vote as much as $7.2 million for training our future employees. And Nissan itself matched with setting aside as much as $52 million for training our people. And then to date, Nissan increased that amount by double that amount. So, and to date, today Nissan in Tennessee employs over 6,000 people. And Nissan also decided to build an engine plant in Decker, Tennessee. But of the 6,000 people, over 1,000 people, when they were newly hired, managers inclusive, were sent to Japan jointly by the state of Tennessee and Nissan, and so that in groups of maybe 30, and so that they can receive on-the-job training lasting like 6 weeks in Japan, and they will have orientation program for Japanese lifestyles also, and whatever they garner, they will bring back to Tennessee, and by having the best of both worlds, they have been producing real high quality vehicles in Smyrna, Tennessee, and I for one am very happy that Nissan made their home in the United States in Tennessee. Now, the man who was named the first president, chief executive officer, Marvin Runyon's name I already mentioned. He was vice president, body and assembly of Ford Motor Company, but he did such a good job that he used to say the people are the greatest asset we have, including stakeholders. And he did such a good job that President Reagan tapped him to be chairman of the Travel TVA. About a year ago, President Bush asked him to become Postmaster General, where I think he's doing a very good job. U.S. Postal Service has had some problems, and I think Marvin Runyon is a good job as Postmaster General today. Before I conclude, I just want to say that over the years, in the last, say, 2 decades, the United States and Japan have become so mutually interdependent. Our economies, we have been bound by mutual security pact also, and culturally also there's so much going on, even between educational institutions in Iowa and the Japanese educational institutions. And then state of Iowa has had a long-standing association with Yamanashi Prefecture, which where Mount Fuji is located. I was told that in 1960, when the Yamanashi Prefecture hit by a terrible typhoon, pigs were sent by generous people here in Iowa, and that was the beginning of Iowa and Yamanashi Prefecture sister state or sister prefecture ties. And again, I'm very grateful to the Iowa people for having sent relief goods to Yamanashi Prefecture. I think Japan probably needs America more than America would need Japan. Mike Mansfield, who was long ago Senate Majority Leader from Montana, was American ambassador to Japan during the Carter administration and also through the Reagan administration. He's Democrat, but he did such a good job in Japan that President Reagan reappointed him as ambassador to Japan. He used to say, the next generation, next century is the century of the Pacific. And that's where the action is going to be, and that's where the growth is foreseen. Also, there's no more important bilateral relationship between between Japan and the United States, barring none. And I fully concur. Japan also needs to play a bigger political, international role. And of course, as you have heard, Prime Minister's leadership role, Miyazawa's leadership role, has been debilitated by the political party scandal involving political contributions, kind of illegal